The world was made of dust and sky, and little else. An endless expanse of pale earth stretched to meet a horizon that never seemed to get any closer, all of it trapped beneath a lid of iron-gray clouds. The wind, a constant and lonesome traveler, whispered through the tall, brittle grass, carrying with it the scent of distant rain that never fell. It was a land that promised nothing and gave even less, a place that could break a person's spirit as surely as it cracked the soil underfoot. Through this unforgiving landscape, a woman walked. Her name was Clara, though she had not heard it spoken aloud in so long that it felt like it belonged to someone else, a ghost from a life that had been burned away. The soles of her feet were raw and blistered, each step a small, sharp pain against the hot, gritty earth. She had lost her shoes weeks ago, another small piece of her past shed and left behind on the long, wandering road to nowhere. Her dress, a faded calico that had once been a cheerful blue, was torn at the hem and stained with the grime of the trail. It hung on her thin frame like a shroud. She did not look up. Her gaze was fixed on the ground just ahead, on the patterns the wind made in the dust, on the slow march of her own feet. To look up was to see the vast, crushing emptiness of the plains, to be reminded of how small and alone she was. It was better to keep her world small, confined to the few feet of earth she currently occupied. For 2 days, she had been following the faint promise of a river, a thin, green line she had spied from a low rise. Water meant life, or at least a reprieve from the slow death of thirst. It might also mean people, a settlement, a place where a woman could trade a day's work for a piece of bread and a dry corner to sleep in. But the last settlement had been a disappointment, a collection of sod houses and suspicious eyes. They had seen the desperation clinging to her, smelled the sorrow that was her constant companion, and turned her away. A woman alone was a problem, a question nobody wanted to answer. A thin-lipped woman with a broom had pointed down the track and said, "Keep moving. We've got nothing for you here." The shame of it was a hot coal in her belly, burning alongside the gnawing emptiness of hunger. Now, the sound of moving water grew from a faint murmur to a gentle, rushing song. Hope, a feeling so foreign and dangerous, flickered weakly in her chest. She pushed through a final screen of willows, their leaves whispering against her arms, and found herself in a small clearing on the riverbank. The river was not wide or powerful, but it was real. It moved slowly, its surface the color of slate, reflecting the overcast sky above. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. For a long moment, she simply stood there, listening to its voice, feeling the cooler air that rose from its surface. Then, with a sigh that seemed to drain the last of her strength, she sank to her knees on the damp earth. Her body trembled with exhaustion, a fine, uncontrollable shaking that had taken root in her bones. She crawled the last few feet to the water's edge and plunged her hands in. The shock of the cold was a clean, sharp jolt that cut through the fog of her weariness. She cupped the water and brought it to her face, washing away the layers of dust and sweat. The water ran in muddy trickles down her neck and into the collar of her dress, but she did not care. It was a baptism of sorts, a washing away of the immediate past, of the hard faces and the closed doors. As she scrubbed at her skin, she began to speak, her voice a low, cracked whisper that was lost in the sound of the river. "Oh, Thomas," she murmured, the name a painful ache in her throat. "You always said a man could find his way by the water, but where does it lead when you have no destination?" She looked at her reflection, a wavering and distorted mask of a stranger with hollow eyes and matted hair. This was not the woman Thomas had married, the one who laughed easily and whose hands were always busy with some task, baking bread, mending a shirt, tending a small garden. That woman had died with him. She dipped her hands again, the cold seeping into her skin. "Sarah," she whispered, the second name even harder to say, a shard of glass in her heart. "My little bird, the water is so cold, just like your hands were." She stopped, her throat closing around the memory. The image of a small, pale hand slipping from her grasp in the blinding white of a blizzard rose up, as vivid and terrible as if it were happening all over again. A dry sob escaped her, a harsh, tearing sound in the quiet clearing. She pressed her wet hands to her face, trying to hold back the grief, trying to push the image away, but it was branded onto the inside of her eyelids. She did not hear the horse. It moved with a quiet, sure-footed grace, its shod hooves making little sound on the soft earth. She did not notice the man until he had already dismounted and stood a dozen feet away, holding the reins of his bay gelding. He was still for a long moment, simply watching her, taking in the slump of her shoulders, the way her whole body seemed to be folded in on itself in a posture of utter defeat. He was not a young man, nor was he old. His face was a map of his life, carved by sun and wind into a terrain of deep lines around his eyes and mouth. A thick, dark mustache covered his upper lip, and his jaw was firm beneath a scruff of beard. There was a stillness about him, a solid, rooted quality, like that of an old oak that had withstood 1,000 storms. He wore practical, worn clothing, denim trousers, a flannel shirt, and a leather vest. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but she could feel their steady gaze on her. When he finally spoke, his voice was not what she expected. It was not harsh or demanding. It was deep and quiet, with a rough, gentle texture, like worn leather. "Are you hungry or just lonely?" The question was so simple, so unexpected, that it struck her silent. It bypassed all the usual inquiries, all the suspicious questions a man might ask a lone woman by a river. He did not ask her name, or where she came from, or what trouble she was in. He looked at her huddled form and saw the two most fundamental pains of the human soul. Hunger. She understood. It was a constant, aching presence in her belly. But loneliness. To have him name the vast, silent emptiness that had consumed her world was to be seen in a way she had not been in a very long time. It was disarming and terrifying. She slowly lowered her hands from her face and looked at him. She saw no judgment in his expression, only a quiet curiosity, a patient waiting. Her first instinct was to run, to scramble back into the wilderness where she could be invisible again. A man's kindness was often just a hook with a sharp barb, a lure into a different kind of trouble. But she had no energy left for running. Her body was an anchor, pinning her to the damp earth. He seemed to understand her hesitation. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if answering an unspoken question. "It is all right," he said, his voice still low. "I mean, you no harm." He turned from her and walked toward a small, flat area a little way back from the riverbank. He unstrapped a bedroll and a small sack from his saddle, with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He gathered a handful of dry twigs and branches and, using a flint and steel, coaxed a small flame to life. The crackle of the fire was a comforting sound, a tiny spark of warmth and life in the gray afternoon. From the sack, he produced a small, blackened coffee pot, a half loaf of dark bread wrapped in cloth, and a tin cup. He filled the pot with river water and set it on the rocks he'd arranged around the fire. The aroma of coffee soon began to drift through the air, rich and earthy and painfully nostalgic. It was the smell of mornings, of home, of a life she no longer had. He broke off a generous piece of the bread and walked back toward her, holding it out. He did not come too close, stopping a few feet away so she would have to rise to take it. For a long moment, she stared at the offering. It was just bread, coarse and plain, but it was also a choice. To accept it was to accept a connection, to step out of the isolation she had wrapped around herself like a shield. Her hunger won. Slowly, shakily, she pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled, and she had to place a hand on the ground to steady herself. She took a step, then another, and took the bread from his outstretched hand. Their fingers did not touch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "My name is Luke Harding," he said, not as a demand for her own name, but as a simple statement of fact. He gestured toward the fire. "Come and get warm. The coffee is almost ready." She followed him back to the small fire and sat on the ground, tucking her bare feet beneath the hem of her dress. She ate the bread slowly, forcing herself not to tear at it like a starving animal. Each bite was a small miracle, filling the aching void in her stomach. Luke poured coffee into the tin cup and handed it to her. She wrapped her cold hands around its warmth, letting the heat seep into her fingers. The coffee was black and bitter, but it was hot, and it sent a welcome fire through her veins. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the murmur of the river. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was a shared quiet, a space that did not need to be filled with words. He seemed to understand that she had no stories she wanted to tell, no explanations to give. He simply drank his own coffee from the pot and stared into the flames, his expression thoughtful and unreadable. He asked no more questions for a time, for which she was grateful. She felt fragile, as if a single wrong word could shatter her into 1,000 pieces. After a while, he spoke again, his voice still quiet. "This river runs west for another 50 miles before it turns south toward the territories. Not many folks out this way." It was a statement, not a question, a gentle way of probing without demanding an answer. She just nodded, her eyes downcast, fixed on the cup in her hands. She could not bring herself to meet his gaze. "It is not a good place to be alone," he added. Her fingers tightened on the cup. "Sometimes there is no choice," she said, the words barely audible. He considered that for a moment. "No," he agreed. "Sometimes there is not." As the afternoon bled into a gray, featureless twilight, a chill began to creep into the air. The warmth of the small fire seemed to push back the encroaching cold by only a few feet. Clara shivered, pulling her thin dress tighter around her shoulders. Luke noticed, without a word. He stood up and went to his horse, returning with his bedroll. He shook it out, a thick wool blanket. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "The temperature will drop sharply once the sun is fully down. You will need this." She hesitated. "I cannot. It is yours." "I have my coat," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I will be fine. Take it." Reluctantly, she took the blanket. It was heavy and smelled of wool, horse, and wood smoke. It smelled of him. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and its weight was a comfort, a small, solid anchor in the cold. He gave her a final nod, then took his saddle and coat and moved away, settling himself near his horse at the edge of the clearing. He made his bed there, a clear and deliberate distance between them, a gesture of respect that she understood and was profoundly grateful for. He was giving her space, giving her the night to herself. But the night brought no peace. Sleep was a distant shore she could not reach. She sat huddled in the blanket, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The darkness that gathered around the small clearing was absolute, pressing in from all sides. In the black, shimmering surface of the river, her own reflection was a faint ghost. She stared at it, and the face of the stranger stared back. But then, as the water rippled, the image shifted, and for a heart-stopping moment, she saw not herself, but the face of her daughter, Sarah, a small, round face with wide, curious eyes. It was just a trick of the light, a phantom created by grief and exhaustion, but it was enough to break through the dam she had built inside herself. Tears she thought had long run dry began to fall, silent and hot on her cold cheeks. They were tears of loss, for the warm weight of her daughter in her arms, for the sound of her husband's steady breathing beside her in the night. But there were other tears, too, brewed from a darker place. Tears of shame. Shame that she had lived when they had not. Shame that she had not been strong enough or smart enough to save them from the fury of the winter. The cold had taken Thomas first, as he'd gone searching for help in a blizzard that had buried their small cabin. And then it had come for Sarah, creeping into the room, silent and relentless, while Clara held her, trying to give her the last of her own body heat, singing lullabies until her own voice gave out. Her shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. She pressed her fist to her mouth to stifle the sound, her body curling into a tight ball of misery beneath the heavy blanket. From his spot by the horse, Luke heard the muffled sounds of her weeping. He lay on his side, propped on an elbow, and watched her shadowy form by the river. He did not move, did not call out. He knew this kind of grief. It was a private, sacred thing, a storm that had to be weathered alone. To offer comfort now would be an intrusion, a clumsy attempt to mend something that was irreparably broken. He had his own ghosts, his own nights spent staring into the darkness, and he recognized the shape of her sorrow. So he simply kept watch, his presence a silent, unobtrusive vigil in the vast, uncaring darkness of the plains. He would let her have her tears. He would guard her solitude. Long before the first hint of dawn, when the sky was still a deep, starless black. Luke was awake. He moved with a practiced quiet, adding a few small branches to the embers of the fire, coaxing them back to a low flame. He brewed another pot of coffee, the smell once again cutting through the cold morning air. He saddled his horse, the creak of the leather seeming loud in the stillness. It was time to leave. He was a man with a destination, with chores waiting for him. He had offered what small comfort he could. Now their paths would diverge. He packed his few belongings, strapped his bedroll behind his saddle, and prepared to mount. But then he stopped. He turned his head and looked toward the riverbank. She was still there. She had not moved all night. She sat in the exact same spot, the wool blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her head bowed so low that her forehead nearly touched her knees. She looked like a statue carved from despair, a monument to loss. The sight of her utter stillness, her complete and total surrender, arrested him. He could not just ride away. He could not leave her there to be swallowed by the wilderness, to simply waste away by the side of the slow, gray river. It was not in him to do so. With a quiet sigh, he looped the reins of his horse around a willow branch and walked back toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his boots making soft sounds on the damp ground. She did not look up, perhaps did not even hear him approach. He stood there for a full minute, watching the pale light of the coming dawn begin to touch the tops of the distant hills. Then he spoke, his voice as quiet and steady as it had been the day before. "There's work at my ranch if you want to earn a meal," he said. The offer was practical, a matter of transaction, not charity. It was an offer she could accept without sacrificing the last tattered remnants of her pride. He paused, then added a second, softer option, or just rest. She did not move for a long time. The words hung in the air between them. Her mind, slow and thick with exhaustion, tried to make sense of them. Work, a meal, rest. They were simple concepts, but they felt as if they belonged to another world, another life. Part of her, the wild, frightened part that had kept her alive this long, screamed at her to refuse, to stay alone, to trust no one. Following a strange man to his isolated ranch was the act of a fool or a woman with no other choice. And she had no other choice. To stay here meant a slow, certain end. The river would offer water, but it would not offer food or shelter or a reason to see the next sunrise. This man, this Luke Harding, was an unknown, a risk. But he had given her bread and coffee. He had given her his blanket and asked for nothing in return. He had looked at her and seen not a beggar or a burden, but a person who was hungry and lonely. Slowly, as if moving a great weight, she lifted her head. She looked at his worn boots, then up at his weathered face. His eyes, in the pale morning light, were clear and direct. She could see the deep lines of hardship etched there, but she saw no deceit, No hidden hunger. She saw only a quiet resolve. A long, shuddering breath escaped her. It was not a breath of hope. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. It was a breath of resignation. The letting go of the last vestige of a fight. She had nowhere else to go. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Luke watched her for a moment longer. Then he nodded back. "All right then," he said simply. He turned and walked back to his horse. He did not rush her. He did not offer her a hand. He simply waited. Clara pushed the heavy blanket off her shoulders and folded it carefully, her movements stiff and clumsy. She left it on the ground where she had sat, pushing herself to her feet. She swayed for a moment, her vision swimming. Then she took a step and another. She walked away from the river, away from the spot that had held her grief for a night, and followed the man and his horse, a small, solitary figure against the vast, opening sky. The journey to Luke Harding's ranch was a silent education in the nature of the land. He rode his steady bay gelding, and Clara followed on foot. He had offered to let her ride, but she had refused, unwilling to accept another kindness she could not repay. So he slowed his horse to her pace, a slow, plodding walk that ate up the miles with agonizing slowness. For the first day, they moved across the same flat, featureless plains that had nearly broken her. The sun beat down from a sky the color of bleached bone, and the heat rose in shimmering waves from the cracked earth. Dust, fine as flour, coated her skin, her hair, the inside of her mouth. It was a landscape of profound indifference, a place that did not care if you lived or died. Luke rode ahead, a solid silhouette against the endless horizon, never looking back but always seeming to know when she was faltering. He would stop without a word, dismount, and hand her the canteen. She would drink, the lukewarm water a balm to her parched throat, and they would continue on. By the second day, the terrain began to change. The world tilted upward in a long, almost imperceptible slope. Low, rolling hills appeared, covered in sagebrush and dotted with gnarled, tenacious junipers. In the far distance, a line of mountains showed itself, their peaks a hazy, purple promise against the western sky. The beauty of it was sharp and painful, a reminder of a world that continued to be magnificent even when her own had been reduced to ashes. The brutality was never far away. A sudden dust storm blew in from the north, a roiling brown wall that turned midday into a suffocating twilight. Luke had them shelter in the lee of a rock outcropping, pulling his neckerchief over his face and handing her his spare. For an hour, the wind howled, whipping sand and grit against them with the force of a physical blow. Clara huddled with her eyes shut tight, the world reduced to the roar of the wind and the solid presence of Luke's body shielding her from the worst of it. When it passed as quickly as it came, the sky was scoured clean, and the air was thin and cold. They saw signs of life and death scattered across the land, the bleached white bones of a buffalo, picked clean by coyotes, a lone hawk circling high overhead on a thermal current, a herd of pronghorn antelope flowing like a river of tan and white over a distant rise. It was a world of predators and prey, of survival and extinction, and she felt acutely like the latter. Late on the third day, they crested a final hill, and Luke gestured with his chin. "There it is," he said. His ranch was nestled in a shallow basin, protected on one side by a low mesa. It was not much, a small cabin, built of sturdy, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a single window, a corral, a small barn, and a water trough fed by a windmill that turned slowly in the constant breeze. A handful of cattle, perhaps 20 head, grazed peacefully in the distance, their hides the color of the reddish earth. The place was stark, functional, and profoundly quiet. It was a small island of human endeavor in a vast sea of wilderness. There was a loneliness to it that she recognized, a solitude that seemed to seep from the very soil. As they drew closer, he spoke, his voice low, It was supposed to be bigger. My brother, Jesse, and we had plans. He paused, his gaze fixed on the cabin. He was killed down near the border a few years back. A skirmish over some stray cattle. Wrong place, wrong time. He said it without emotion. A simple statement of a fact that had shaped his entire life. After that, I never saw the need for much more than this. He looked over at her. Never married. Just never seemed to be in the cards for me. He was offering her a piece of his history, a small explanation for the quiet man and his quiet life. She understood it as the gift it was and accepted it with a silent nod. There was a kinship in their losses, a shared language of things that had been planned for and then taken away. The inside of the cabin was as simple as the outside. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was built into one corner, and a small cot was folded against the opposite wall. Shelves held a few tins of food, a stack of plates, and a handful of books. It was a man's space, neat and ordered, but lacking any touch of softness. He gestured to the cot. "You can have that. It is not much, but it is better than the ground." In the days that followed, a slow, quiet routine began to form. Clara, desperate to earn her keep, looked for work. At first, she was weak, her movements slow and clumsy, but the simple act of having a purpose began to rekindle something within her. She started with small chores. She washed the few dishes, swept the wooden floor until it was clean of dust, and mended a tear in one of his shirts with thread she found in a small wooden box. Her stitches were small and even, a skill from her past life returning to her hands. Luke never told her what to do. He would leave in the morning to tend to his cattle or mend fences at the far end of his property. And when he returned at dusk, he would find a pot of something warm simmering over the fire, usually a simple stew of beans and salted meat. But it was hot and filling. He would find his shirts washed and laid out to dry on the bushes near the cabin. He never said much, but she would see the way his eyes would briefly take in the small changes, the quiet order she was bringing to his solitary existence. A small nod, a quiet, "much obliged," was all the thanks he offered, and it was all she needed. Slowly, her strength began to return. The food, the rest, and the rhythm of daily work began to knit her back together. The gaunt, hollowed-out look in her face began to soften. Color returned to her cheeks. Her hands, though calloused from drawing water and scrubbing clothes, grew steady. She began to explore the small area around the cabin, finding a patch of wild onions near the creek bed and a bush of tart berries that she boiled down into a simple jam. These small discoveries felt like victories, proof that she could still create, could still nurture. About 2 weeks after she arrived, the outside world intruded. Luke needed supplies from the settlement, a place called Cottonwood Crossing, a day's ride away. He asked if she needed anything. She hesitated, then asked if he might have an old flour sack she could fashion into an apron. The next evening, he returned not with a flour sack, but with 2 lengths of sturdy gingham cloth and a small packet of needles and thread. He placed them on the table without a word, a silent acknowledgement of her efforts. But he had brought something else back with him as well, the first whispers of gossip. Cottonwood Crossing was a small community, and the sight of Luke Harding, a man who kept to himself, buying cloth for a woman, was enough to set tongues wagging. Who was she? Where had she come from? A man did not simply take in a stray woman without reason. The conclusions they drew were as harsh and unforgiving as the land itself. Clara felt the change the next time they saw a neighbor, a rider from a nearby ranch. A man named Henderson stopped by for a cup of coffee, as was the custom. When he saw Clara emerge from the cabin, his eyes widened, and a slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. He tipped his hat to her, but his gaze was insolent, traveling over her worn dress in a way that made her skin crawl. His conversation with Luke was filled with sly innuendos and questions about whether Luke was finding his new housekeeper to be a good worker. Luke's answers were short and clipped, his jaw tight, until Henderson finally took the hint and rode off, looking back over his shoulder with a laugh. The shame was a familiar, bitter taste in Clara's mouth. She had thought, in the quiet isolation of the ranch, that she might have escaped it, but it had found her. She was a marked woman. The whispers grew louder. A few weeks later, they had to go into town together. One of the wagon wheels needed a new iron rim, a job only the town blacksmith could do. The moment they rode down the single dusty street of Cottonwood Crossing, Clara felt the weight of 100 eyes on her. Women stopped sweeping their porches to stare, their faces hard with judgment. Men sitting outside the saloon lowered their voices and nudged each other. At the general store, the feeling was suffocating. While Luke spoke to the proprietor about grain, Clara tried to make herself small, examining a display of canned peaches. Two women stood nearby, pretending to look at bolts of fabric, their voices pitched just loud enough for her to hear. "That's her," one said. "The one Harding is keeping. Looks half-starved," the other replied, her voice dripping with scorn. "Lord only knows what kind of gutter he pulled her from. No decent woman would live with a man she is not married to. She is a fallen woman, plain and simple." The words struck Clara like stones. She stood perfectly still, her back to them, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the shelf. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt the familiar hot sting of tears behind her eyes. But she would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She silently bore the remarks, letting them wash over her, adding another layer to the thick armor of grief she wore around her heart. A man's voice, loud and laced with contempt, cut through the quiet hum of the store. "Well, look what we have here, if it is not Harding and his little stray." Clara turned to see a large, broad-shouldered man with a florid face and a self-important air about him. This was Jedediah Thorne, the owner of the largest ranch in the county, a man used to getting his own way. He was looking directly at Clara, his mouth twisted in a sneer. Luke stepped away from the counter, placing himself slightly in front of Clara. His posture did not change, but a dangerous stillness settled over him. "Thorne," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You have business with me?" Thorne laughed, a booming, unpleasant sound. "Business? I am just admiring your taste, though I prefer my women with a bit more meat on their bones. And a bit less trail dust." He winked at the other men in the store, who chuckled nervously. Clara flinched as if he had struck her. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floorboards. Luke did not raise his voice. He took a single, slow step closer to the big rancher. "You will lower your voice," he said, the words quiet but carrying the cold weight of a final warning. "And you will not speak of the lady again." Thorne's face darkened with anger. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by a small-time rancher like Luke. "The lady?" he scoffed. "That is a generous term for what you have shacked up with." Luke's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped along the bone. "That is the last time I will tell you," he said, his eyes as hard and gray as river stones. For a long moment, the two men stood facing each other, the air in the store thick with unspoken violence. Thorne, for all his bluster, seemed to recognize something in Luke's steady gaze that gave him pause. With a final, contemptuous snort, he turned on his heel. "This town is going to the dogs," he muttered, and stormed out of the store. The ride back to the ranch was long and silent. The confrontation had left a foul taste in the air. When they finally arrived, Luke went straight to the woodpile and began to chop firewood with a fierce, controlled energy that was more eloquent than any words. That night, as they sat by the fire in the cabin, the silence stretched between them, heavy with the events of the day. Clara knew she had to speak. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "for what you did in the store." Luke did not look at her. He stared into the flames, poking at a log with a piece of kindling. "A man has no right to speak to a woman that way," he said, his voice rough. He brushed it off, but she could see the hard set of his jaw, the anger still simmering in his eyes. The injustice of it, the casual cruelty of Thorne and the others, had angered him on a level she was only beginning to understand. It was not just for her. It was an offense against some deeply held code of decency that he lived by. The fire crackled, filling the quiet space. The shared moment of conflict, of him standing for her, had shifted something between them. It had forged a new, fragile link in the chain of their connection. "I once had someone," Luke said suddenly, his voice so low she almost missed it. He was still staring into the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering light. "Her name was Eleanor. We were going to be married." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unspoken years. "We were traveling to visit her family. Our wagon was stopped by two men. They wanted the money I was carrying to buy a small piece of land next to my father's. I tried to fight them." He stopped again, and a deep, shuddering breath escaped him. She was killed in the struggle. A stray bullet. She died right there on the road." He finally looked up, and in his eyes, Clara saw a grief as deep and raw as her own. "The worst part," he said, his voice thick, "is that I have often thought that I should have died with her, that it was my fault for trying to be a hero." The raw honesty of his confession cracked open the shell of Clara's own carefully guarded sorrow. She saw in his face the same guilt that haunted her own quiet moments. She heard in his voice the same questions that whispered to her in the dark. In that moment, they were not a man and a woman, a rancher and a stray. They were two survivors, two people who had looked into the abyss and been left behind. "My husband," she began, her own voice trembling. "His name was Thomas. We had a daughter, Sarah." Saying their names aloud was like opening a wound, but it was a hurt that needed air. "We were caught in a blizzard last winter. Our cabin was buried. Thomas went for help. He never came back. We found him in the spring, less than a mile from the next homestead." She swallowed hard, the memory of physical pain in her chest. "Sarah grew so cold. I held her. I tried to keep her warm. I sang to her until she was gone. I think the thing that haunts me is the quiet, the way her hand felt in mine when it stopped being warm." Tears streamed down her face, but she did not hide them. For the first time, she was not crying alone. She was sharing the crushing weight of her story. And in return, he was holding the weight of his. They sat in the firelight, their shared confessions hanging in the air, a testament to all they had lost. The honesty between them, stark and painful, began to thaw the frozen landscapes of their hearts. In the weeks that followed, a subtle change settled over the small ranch. The quiet was still there, but it was no longer the quiet of emptiness. It was the quiet of companionship. Luke found himself relying on her presence in ways he had not anticipated. He began to look forward to the smell of coffee when he came in from the cold, to the sight of a candle burning in the window as he rode in after dark. Her quiet strength was a steadying force, a silent counterpoint to his own solitude. For Clara, the ranch became the first safe harbor she had known in years. The sturdy log walls of the cabin felt like a fortress against the harsh judgments of the world. The rhythm of the chores was a balm to her restless spirit. For the first time since the blizzard, she began to sleep through the night without waking from nightmares of snow and ice. She was beginning to feel the faint stirrings of something she had thought was lost to her forever, a sense of peace. Yet, even in the growing comfort of their shared life, the ghosts of the past were never truly gone. In the quiet moments, they would return. Luke would sometimes stand by the window for a long time, staring out at the empty plains, his hand clenching and unclenching, lost in the memory of a dusty road and a moment of violence he could never take back. And Clara, while watching the sun set, would see the silhouette of a small child in the shapes of the clouds, and she would feel the phantom weight of a small, cold hand slipping from her own. They were two wounded people, finding a fragile solace in each other's company, their new, tentative bond built upon the shared bedrock of their sorrows. The fragile piece of the ranch could not hold against the poison seeping out from Cottonwood Crossing. Autumn arrived, painting the leaves of the few cottonwood trees along the creek in strokes of brilliant, dying gold. But the beauty of the season was soured by a growing chill that had little to do with the weather. The prejudice that had been whispered in the general store now took on a harder, more menacing form. The rumors twisted and grew uglier with each telling. Clara was no longer just a stray Luke Harding had taken in. She was a woman of sly and wicked ways. They said she had the devil's own luck in her eyes, that she had cast some kind of spell on him. Why else would a sensible, solitary man like Luke turn his back on his neighbors for a woman with no name and no past? Jedediah Thorne, his pride still smarting from the confrontation in the store, fanned the flames of this suspicion. He spoke loudly in the saloon of how Harding's judgment had clouded, how his cattle looked thin, how his fences were falling into disrepair, all since that woman had arrived. The rumor that she was a witch, a creature who would drain a man of his sense and his property, took root in the fertile soil of fear and ignorance. The hostility was no longer confined to words. One morning, Luke rode out to find the northern fence of his best grazing pasture had been cut. 3 of his best heifers were gone. There was no proof, no one to blame, but he knew it was a message. A few days later, the wooden gate to the main corral was smashed, its hinges broken, a senseless act of vandalism that took him a full day to repair. Clara saw the toll it was taking on him. A new tension settled in his shoulders. A hard, watchful look entered his eyes. He spent more time riding the perimeter of his land, his rifle resting in the scabbard on his saddle, his face grim. He said little about the incidents, but she felt his anger and his worry as a constant, low hum in the small cabin. She felt the weight of the blame settle on her own shoulders. Before she had arrived, his life had been quiet and undisturbed. She was a stone dropped into the calm pool of his existence, and the ripples were turning into destructive waves. She began to eat less, her appetite stolen by guilt, and the strength she had so carefully regained began to leach away. The situation came to a head on a cold, clear morning. The sky was a pale, hard blue, and a sharp wind rattled the cabin's lone window. The sound of approaching horses, not one, but several, brought them both to their feet. Luke moved to the doorway, his body instinctively blocking the entrance, and Clara stood behind him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. It was Jedediah Thorne. He sat on his big roan horse, flanked by 2 of his surly, loyal ranch hands. A 4th man was with them, a stranger with shifty eyes and a nervous twitch in his cheek. They did not ride up to the cabin in a neighborly fashion, but stopped 20 yards out, positioning their horses in a loose, intimidating semicircle. "Harding," Thorne called out, his voice full of false authority. "We have business with the woman." Luke did not move. His hands were loose at his sides, his demeanor deceptively calm. "My business is my own. Thorne, ride on." "Not this time," Thorne sneered. "We have a complaint, a serious one." He gestured to the stranger. "This man, Mr. Abernathy, is a merchant from Willow Creek, 2 counties over. He recognized your woman, says her name is Abigail, and she worked for him. Says she ran off a few months back with his strongbox, containing nearly $100. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. The lie was so specific, so audacious. She had never been to a place called Willow Creek, had never seen the twitchy-eyed man in her life. She took a half-step back, the accusation landing like a physical blow. Luke's voice was dangerously quiet. "Is that so?" "It is," Thorne said, his confidence growing. "He has come to claim his property and see that justice is done. We are here as witnesses to make sure she does not try to run again." Luke's eyes moved from Thorne to the so-called Mr. Abernathy. The man flinched under his direct, assessing gaze. "You are a liar," Luke said, not with heat, but with a cold, simple certainty that was more damning than any shout. "I can see it on you. You were paid to come here and say these things." Abernathy's face paled. "No, she is the one. She stole from me." "Look me in the eye and say it again," Luke commanded, his voice dropping to a low growl. The man stammered, his gaze darting away to Thorn, seeking support. But Thorn's face was a mask of fury. This was not going as he had planned. He had expected Harding to be cowed, to throw the woman out to save his own skin. "It does not matter what you think. Harding," Thorn spat. "We have a witness. We are taking the thief back to town to see the sheriff." One of his hands moved toward Clara, beckoning her forward. "Come on now. Let's not make this any messier than it has to be." "You will not lay a hand on her," Luke said, and for the first time, a flicker of true menace entered his voice. He took a single step forward, away from the cabin door. "You and your hired liar have 5 seconds to turn your horses around and ride off my land. If you are still here after that, I will consider it trespassing with intent to do harm, and I will defend my home." He did not reach for a weapon. He did not need to. The sheer force of his conviction, the absolute, unshakable certainty in his stance, was more potent than any threat of violence. He was a man on his own ground, defending his own hearth, and in that moment, he seemed to grow taller, his presence as solid and immovable as the mesa behind him. Thorn hesitated. He looked at Luke, then at his men, who were beginning to look uneasy. They were paid to punch cattle, not to get into a shooting war with a man who looked as if he had nothing left to lose. The bluff had been called with a curse. Thorn wrenched his horse's head around. "This is not over. Harding," he snarled over his shoulder. "You have made an enemy of this town. You will regret this." They galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick, ringing silence in their wake. For a long time after they were gone, Luke stood staring at the empty space where they had been. His shoulders were rigid, and when he finally turned, Clara saw that his face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. The confrontation had shaken him deeply, not from fear, but from a profound, soul-weary disgust at the depths of men's cruelty. That afternoon, while Luke was out checking the fences again, Clara made a decision. She could not stay. She could not be the cause of his ruin. He had saved her from the river, but she would not let her presence drag him under. Her belongings were few: the gingham cloth he had bought her, now sewn into a simple apron, and the worn dress she stood in. There was nothing else. She scribbled a short, clumsy note on a piece of brown wrapping paper she found, her words smudged by a falling tear. "You were kind. I will not bring you more trouble. Forgive me." She left it on the table and slipped out of the cabin. She did not know where she would go, only that she had to leave. He found her near the corral, just as she was about to walk out onto the open plains. The sound of his footsteps made her stop, but she could not turn to face him. "Where do you think you are going?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "Away," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. "They will not stop until they have ruined you. It is because of me. I will not be the reason for it." He came to stand beside her, so close she could feel the heat of him. "You think leaving will solve it? You think they will suddenly decide to be my friends again if you walk away from here?" "It will be better for you," she insisted, her voice breaking. "I bring nothing but trouble." He was silent for a long moment. The wind picked up, whipping a strand of her hair across her face. Then he spoke, his voice low and fierce. "If they hate you, they'll hate me too. Let them—" The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Let them. It was a declaration of war on the world, a drawing of a line in the sand. It was him, and it was her, on one side, and everyone else on the other. He was choosing her. He was choosing this trouble, this isolation, this fight. He was choosing to stand with her, against all of it. Overwhelmed, she finally turned to look at him. His face was set, his eyes burning with a defiant fire she had never seen there before. All her resolve crumbled. She had been ready to face the wilderness, to face starvation, to face anything alone. But she did not know how to fight against this man's stubborn, selfless loyalty. As she stood there, trembling on the verge of tears, he slowly lifted his hand. It was a large hand, rough and calloused from years of hard labor, the knuckles scarred, the fingernails blunt and clean. He reached out and, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a hand, he took hers. He did not grasp it, but simply covered it, his palm warm and solid over her own cold, trembling fingers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of something deeper, more fundamental. It was a silent promise, a forging of an alliance in the face of a hostile world. It was the first true intimacy they had ever shared, and she, for the first time in a very long time, did not pull away. She let her hand rest in his, a silent acceptance of his choice, and a quiet surrender to the terrifying, wonderful fact that she was no longer alone. A few days later, a cold autumn rain began to fall. It was not a storm, but a steady, relentless drizzle that turned the hard-packed earth around the cabin into a slick, greasy mud. It was the kind of rain that soaked into a man's bones and stayed there. The fence Thorne's men had damaged needed more than a simple repair. Several posts had been loosened and needed to be reset before the ground froze solid. It was miserable work, but it had to be done. Luke went out after a meager breakfast, his oilskin coat pulled tight around him. Clara watched him from the doorway for a few minutes, saw how the mud sucked at his boots, how he struggled to work with cold, wet hands. Without a second thought, she pulled on an old, oversized coat of his that hung on a peg by the door and went out to join him. He looked up in surprise as she approached. "You should stay inside. There is no sense in both of us getting soaked." "An extra pair of hands is an extra pair of hands," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. And so they worked. They worked together in the cold, driving rain, the world around them a gray, dripping canvas. A new rhythm soon established itself between them, a synchronized dance of shared labor. He would dig a new hole with the post digger, his muscles straining in the thick, heavy soil. She would be there, ready with the new post, helping him guide it into the ground. He would hold it steady, his body braced against its weight, while she shoveled earth and rocks back into the hole, tamping it down with her boot heels until the post stood firm. He would stretch the wire, and she would hand him the staples and the hammer, their movements so in tune that words became unnecessary. Their eyes met often across the short distance that separated them. In his, she saw a grudging respect, a quiet gratitude. In hers, he saw a steady, resilient strength that he was only just beginning to comprehend. They were drenched, their hair plastered to their heads, their clothes heavy with rain and mud. But in the shared misery of the task, something warm and solid was being built between them. They were a team, a partnership. That night, utterly exhausted, they sat by the fire, their wet clothes steaming in the heat. The physical toll of the day's labor had left them too tired for words. But the silence was comfortable, filled with a new and profound understanding. Sleep, when it came, was a deep and dreamless void for Clara, until the old ghosts returned. The nightmare was always the same, the blinding white of the blizzard, the suffocating feeling of being buried alive, the howling of the wind that sounded like a hungry wolf, and the cold, the terrible, piercing cold that stole the breath from her lungs and the life from her child. She was holding Sarah, her small body rigid and still, her face as white as the snow, and she was screaming, a silent, soundless scream of pure agony. She awoke with a choked gasp, sitting bolt upright on her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was dark, the fire burned down to glowing embers. She was trembling, slick with a cold sweat. A floorboard creaked. "Clara!" Luke's voice came out of the darkness, low and concerned. In an instant, he was kneeling beside her cot. She could not see his face clearly, only his dark shape against the faint orange glow of the embers. He reached out and placed his hands on her shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding. "You are all right," he whispered, his voice a steady anchor in the terrifying aftermath of the dream. "It was just a dream. You are here. You are safe." She shuddered, a long, deep tremor that shook her entire body. The dream still clung to her, its icy tendrils wrapped around her heart. "It felt so real," she choked out. "I know," he said, his voice full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. He did not let go of her shoulders. He just knelt there, his presence a warm, solid shield against the darkness. After a long moment, her trembling began to subside. In the raw, vulnerable space that the nightmare had carved open, a terrible confession escaped her lips, a truth she had never dared to speak aloud. "Sometimes," she whispered to the darkness, "I wish I hadn't survived. I wish I had frozen to death with them." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. It was the ultimate expression of her guilt, her despair. She expected him to say something placating, to offer empty words of comfort. But he was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, but his words were simple, clear, and utterly sincere. "Then I am glad you did." Her breath caught in her throat. He was glad. He was glad that she had survived. In that one, simple sentence. He gave her back something she thought she had lost forever, a reason. He was not just offering comfort. He was affirming her life, her right to exist, her value. It was the most profound act of love she had ever known. A fragile, unspoken bond of love began to form in the days that followed. It was not declared in words or grand gestures. It lived in the small, quiet moments that made up their life. It was in the way he began to keep a small pail of hot coals from the main fire near her cot at night, so the worst of the chill would not reach her. It was in the way she mended the cuff of his favorite shirt before he even noticed it was frayed. It was in the way he would leave a rare wildflower he had found on the plains on the table for her in the morning, and the way she would save the tenderest piece of rabbit from the stew for his plate. Their conversations were still sparse, but their glances began to linger, filled with a depth of feeling that words could not express. But as their small, private world grew warmer, the world outside grew darker, the early frosts were sharp and frequent, the birds flew south in great, noisy flocks, and the squirrels frantically gathered nuts, their haste a sure sign of a hard winter to come. Food was becoming scarce across the territory. A poor harvest and a dry summer meant that grain was expensive, and game was harder to find. Tensions between the larger ranchers like Thorne and the smaller homesteaders were escalating, with disputes over water rights and grazing land turning bitter and sometimes violent. Winter was looming, not just as a season, but as a threat, a great, white wolf gathering itself to leap upon the land, and their small cabin, their fragile sanctuary of two, stood directly in its path. The winter did not creep in. It attacked. It arrived overnight in a fury of wind and snow, a brutal, conquering army that swept across the plains and laid siege to the small ranch. The world, which had been a study in the muted browns and golds of autumn, was transformed into a stark, merciless canvas of white and gray. The wind howled with a mournful, hungry sound, piling snow into massive drifts that buried fences and reshaped the landscape into something alien and hostile. The river, the slow, steady artery of life that had first drawn Clara to this place, succumbed to the cold. It froze over, its current silenced beneath a thick, opaque sheet of ice. The silence it left behind was profound, a deadening of the world's pulse. The only sounds left were the shrieking of the wind and, at night, a new and terrifying addition to the chorus, wolves, driven down from the high country by hunger, began to prowl the edges of the ranch. Their long, chilling howls would rise up in the darkness, a reminder of the sharp-toothed, desperate world that lay just beyond the thin log walls of the cabin. Their small stockpile of supplies began to dwindle faster than Luke had anticipated. One morning, under a sky the color of lead, he announced he had to make a trip for flour and salt pork, not to town, but to a remote trading post a half-day's ride north, a place where he hoped to avoid the hostile eyes of Cottonwood Crossing. Clara watched him go, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The world outside the cabin had become a menacing place, and she felt a primal fear at being left alone, and an equal fear for his safety in the treacherous cold. He did not return at dusk, as the light failed and the temperature plummeted. Clara's anxiety grew into a sharp, painful fear. She kept the lamp burning in the window, a tiny beacon in the vast, snowy darkness, and paced the small cabin, her ears straining for the sound of his horse. The wolf howls began, seeming closer than ever before, and every gust of wind that rattled the door sounded like a phantom knock. It was nearly midnight when she finally heard it, the exhausted, stumbling gait of a horse. She threw the door open, ignoring the blast of Arctic air that swept inside. Luke was slumped over in the saddle, his face pale and beaded with sweat despite the freezing cold. He practically fell into her arms as he dismounted, his full weight leaning on her. "My leg," he grunted, his voice tight with pain. "Horse slipped on a patch of ice. The grain sack, it fell on me." Somehow, she got him inside and onto his bed. His left trouser leg was soaked in blood, a dark, ugly stain against the denim. With trembling hands, she cut the fabric away with a skinning knife. A deep, ragged gash ran along his shin, and the ankle below it was swollen to twice its normal size, already turning a sickening shade of purple. The bone was not broken. She prayed, but it was a serious, debilitating injury. In that moment, everything shifted. The protector was fallen, the provider laid low. The entire weight of their survival, of this small, fragile world they had built, settled squarely onto Clara's shoulders. The fear was a cold, paralyzing thing inside her, but she looked at Luke's pain-drawn face, at his utter dependence on her, and something else rose up to meet it, a fierce, grim resolve. She had lost a husband and a child to the indifference of winter. She would not lose this man. The days that followed were a blur of relentless, back-breaking labor. Clara, who had once been a wanderer on the edge of starvation, became the sole engine of their existence. Her quiet strength, forged in the crucible of her grief, began to shine through. She learned to swing an axe, her small frame at first seeming no match for the thick, seasoned logs. Her first attempts were clumsy, the axe head bouncing off the wood, jarring her arms and shoulders. But she persisted, learning to read the grain, to put the weight of her body into each swing, until the clean, satisfying crack of splitting wood became a rhythm of her days. She hauled the wood inside, her arms aching, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and kept the fire, the heart of their world, roaring day and night. She took Luke's rifle from its pegs on the wall. It was heavy and awkward in her hands, its cold steel a foreign and frightening thing. But need was a stern teacher. She practiced loading and aiming, her jaw set in concentration. Then she went out into the blinding white landscape, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. She learned to hunt, to move quietly, to wait with infinite patience for the sight of a snowshoe hare. The first time she killed one, the crack of the rifle echoing in the vast silence. She felt a wave of nausea, but she pushed it down. Field dressed the animal with methodical, necessary movements, and carried it back to the cabin. That night, they ate rabbit stew, and the meat gave them strength. She tended to Luke with a gentle, unwavering focus. She cleaned and bandaged his leg, tearing up one of her few precious pieces of cloth to do so. She brewed willow bark tea to bring down his fever, a remedy she remembered from her grandmother. She brought him water, cooked for him, and sat by his bed in the long, dark hours of the night when the pain was at its worst. A silent, watchful presence. One evening, about a week after his accident, his fever had finally broken. The swelling in his ankle had gone down, though the gash was still a raw, angry red. It was time to clean it again. She brought a basin of warm water and a clean rag to his bedside. The cabin was quiet, lit only by the soft, flickering light of the fire. Outside, the wind had died down, and a heavy snow was falling, muffling the world in a blanket of profound silence. She knelt on the floor beside his bed and gently began to wash the wound. Her touch was feather-light, careful not to cause him any more pain. For a man of his size and strength, he was utterly helpless, completely vulnerable. His injury had stripped away his stoicism, leaving behind a raw weariness she had never seen before. He watched her, his eyes dark with a mixture of pain and some other, deeper emotion. The intimacy of the moment was palpable, her hands on his skin, the shared quiet of the cabin, the feeling that they were the only two people left in the world. It stirred something deep within both of them. "You should not have to do this," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He looked away from her, toward the fire, his expression clouded with a familiar guilt. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your care." Clara paused, her hands still. She looked at his face, at the lines of pain and exhaustion etched there. She saw the ghost of another man, Eleanor's lost fiancé, the man who believed he should have died on a dusty road years ago. Her heart ached for him, for the burden of guilt he carried. She finished cleaning the wound, her movements deliberate. Then she looked directly at him, her gaze clear and steady. "You're the first person," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Who ever asked if I was hungry?" The simple, profound truth of her words hung in the air between them. It was not about deserving. It was not about payment or debt. It was about a circle of kindness, started by him on a lonely riverbank, that had now come back to him. It was the only currency that mattered in their stripped-down world. He turned his head to look at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He saw not a victim, not a stray, but the woman who had chopped his wood, hunted for his food, and nursed him back from the edge. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering heart. And in that moment, he felt a love so deep and powerful it was a physical ache in his chest. Slowly, he reached up and touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, questioning. She did not pull back. Instead, she leaned into his hand, a silent surrender. The air grew thick, charged with all the unspoken words, all the shared sorrows, all the fragile hopes that had grown between them in the silence. He drew her closer, and she went willingly. Their first kiss was not a thing of passion or fire. It was hesitant and aching, a soft, trembling meeting of lips that tasted of salt and sorrow. It was filled with a terrible, beautiful fear, the fear of two broken people daring to feel something again, the fear of offering up their shattered hearts and trusting that the other would hold them gently. It was a kiss that asked everything and demanded nothing. Later that night, the snow continued to fall, burying the world deeper and deeper. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, an unspoken need, a profound human craving for warmth and connection in the face of a cold and desolate world, drew them together. She left her cot and went to him, and he made a space for her in his narrow bed. Their coming together was as quiet and solemn as a prayer. It was less an act of passion than a desperate search for sanctuary. It was the simple, profound comfort of skin against skin, of one warm body shielding another from the cold, of two lonely souls finding a temporary haven in each other's arms. In the vast, uncaring wilderness, under the weight of a burying snow, they clung to each other, two small embers of life and warmth against the encroaching darkness. It was a moment of quiet, desperate love that became the emotional core of their story, the center from which everything else would now grow. For weeks, the snow kept them prisoner. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. Their life shrank to the dimensions of the single room, to the cycle of stoking the fire, rationing their food, and tending to Luke's slow-healing leg. They were utterly isolated, completely dependent on each other for everything. In this forced intimacy, all remaining barriers between them dissolved. They spoke of their pasts, not with the raw pain of their first confessions, but with a gentler, more reflective sorrow. They shared stories of their childhoods, of small joys and simple dreams. He learned about the father who taught her the names of wildflowers. She learned about the brother who had taught him how to track a deer. One afternoon, searching for new bandages in a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed, Clara found an old, leather-bound Bible. Its cover was worn smooth with time, the pages thin and soft. It had belonged to his mother. He told her. He had not opened it in years. That evening, by the light of the fire, she began to read to him. Her voice was soft and clear in the quiet cabin. She did not choose passages of wrath or judgment, but sought out the words of mercy and endurance. She read from the Psalms, of finding refuge in the shadow of a rock in a weary land. She read from Isaiah, of hope for the brokenhearted and comfort for those who mourn. The ancient words, spoken into the heart of their own desolate winter, were a profound comfort to them both. It was not about doctrine or dogma. It was about two people finding a sliver of grace in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of the word. As Luke's leg healed, their relationship deepened into something that felt, for the first time in either of their lives, like home. The cabin, once just a shelter, was now a place filled with shared memories and a quiet, resilient love. He would watch her as she kneaded dough for bread, his gaze full of a tender admiration that needed no words. She would catch him smiling, a real, genuine smile, as she recounted a story, and the sight of it would make her heart feel impossibly full. But even as the ice in their hearts thawed, the world outside remained frozen, and the hatred in Cottonwood Crossing had not abated. It had merely gone dormant, hibernating under the snow, waiting for the spring. Jedediah Thorne had spent the winter stoking his resentment, his stories of the bewitching woman and the fool she had made of Luke Harding becoming town legend. He spoke openly in the saloon of the reckoning that was coming. Harding had defied him, had defied the whole town, to keep that woman. Come the thaw. Thorne swore to anyone who would listen. He would ruin him. He would see that woman driven out and Luke Harding's ranch broken and sold. A stark lesson to any who would challenge the established order of things. The winter had isolated them, but it had not saved them. It had only delayed the coming storm. The spring thaw came with the violence of a revolution. The great silent sheet of ice that had entombed the river for months began to groan and crack, the sounds echoing through the valley like pistol shots. Huge, jagged plates of ice broke free and ground against each other, piling up on the banks in a chaotic jumble before the freed water. Now a muddy, churning torrent swept them away. The world awoke with a great, wet sigh. The smell of damp earth and new life rose from the melting snow, and the birds returned, their songs a stark, cheerful contrast to the howling of the winter wind. For Clara and Luke, the spring brought a fragile, cautious hope. His leg had healed to a dull ache, and the strength had returned to his limbs. They worked together, repairing the damage the winter had wrought, their movements falling into the easy, unspoken rhythm of two people who knew each other's minds. The cabin, their winter fortress, now felt small and stuffy, and they spent their days out in the pale, hopeful sunlight. It was a time of quiet rebuilding, a shared peace that felt all the more precious for its hard-won nature. But like the river, their peace was a torrent running over a bed of unseen dangers. The melting of the snow meant the roads were passable again. It meant that the world they had been hidden from could once more find them. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a traveling tinker who stopped for water. He was a garrulous old man who brought news from the surrounding territories. But when he saw Clara, his friendly demeanor cooled. He spoke to Luke in low, clipped tones, his eyes darting toward her with a mixture of fear and suspicion. He told them that Jedediah Thorne had spent the winter poisoning the well of public opinion, that the story of the thieving woman from Willow Creek was now accepted as fact throughout the county. He warned Luke that there was talk of running him off his land come spring. When the tinker left, a cold silence settled between them. The outside world had remembered them, and its memory was long and filled with malice. A week later, their fragile hope was shattered completely. They were outside, mending a harness near the corral. When the sound of multiple riders came over the rise, it was not a friendly approach. The hoofbeats were heavy and purposeful. Luke straightened up, his hand instinctively going to the axe he had been using, his face becoming a hard, unreadable mask. Sheriff Brody of Cottonwood Crossing led the group, a tarnished star pinned to his vest, but it was clear who was truly in charge. Jedediah Thorne rode beside him, his face flushed with triumph. Behind them was a posse of a half-dozen men, ranchers and townsfolk who had been whipped into a righteous mob by Thorne's lies. They carried rifles and a grim sense of purpose. They fanned out, surrounding the small cabin and the two figures who stood before it, cutting off any chance of escape. "Luke Harding," the sheriff called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet air. "I have a warrant here for the arrest of one Abigail Flowers, also known as Clara, for the crime of theft." Luke took a step forward, placing himself between Clara and the riders. "You know as well as I do that is a lie. Sheriff, you have no proof." "I have a signed complaint from the victim," Brody said, avoiding Luke's gaze and looking instead at a point on the horizon. "And I have a duty to perform. Stand aside." "No," Luke said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as the mesa at his back. "You will not take her. She has done nothing wrong." Thorne spurred his horse forward, a cruel smirk on his face. "Still playing the hero. Harding, your woman is a common thief. The whole county knows it. Now, you can step aside and let the law handle this, or you can be arrested for obstructing justice. It is your choice." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "He is right. Luke, do not make this harder than it needs to be. I will see she gets a fair trial." "A fair trial?" Luke's voice was laced with a bitter irony. "In a town that has already judged and condemned her, with a jury you and Thorne will handpick? There is no justice here. There is only malice." He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Clara's. She was trembling, her face as white as a fresh snowfall. The sight of her terror fueled his resolve. But her terror was not just for herself. It was for him. She saw the impossible situation they were in. Luke, armed only with an axe, against a half-dozen men with rifles. He would be arrested, or worse, killed. And it would all be her fault. The guilt was a suffocating wave, drowning out every other thought. She could not let him be destroyed for her. In that frantic, desperate moment, only one solution presented itself. If she confessed, they would take her and leave him alone. Her life was already broken. His did not have to be. A strange, terrible calm settled over her. She took a shuffling step forward, out from behind the shield of his body. "It is all right," she said, her voice a thin, reedy sound she barely recognized as her own. I will go with you." Luke's head snapped around, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw the look on her face, the dead, sacrificial resolve, and understood what she was about to do. Before she could say another word, he reached out and grabbed her hand, his fingers like a steel band around her wrist. He pulled her back behind him with a force that was almost rough. "No," he commanded, his voice a low, fierce growl meant only for her. He leaned closer, his eyes boring into hers, willing her to understand. "You don't bow to men like them, not ever." His words, his touch, the sheer, unyielding force of his will, broke the spell of her despair. He would not let her sacrifice herself. He would rather fight and lose than surrender to the injustice of it all. Thorn saw the exchange, and his patience finally snapped. "Enough of this!" he roared. He swung down from his horse, his face purple with rage. "If he will not step aside, then we will move him." He lunged at Luke. Luke, caught off guard, sidestepped the clumsy charge and shoved Thorn hard, sending the bigger man stumbling back into the dirt. The sight of their leader being humbled was all it took for the posse's fragile discipline to break. Two of Thorn's ranch hands jumped from their horses and rushed forward. The world exploded into a chaos of shouting and violence. Luke swung the handle of the axe, not the blade, in a wide arc, forcing the first man to backpedal. But the second one came at him from the side, tackling him around the waist. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs in the mud. Luke fought with a desperate, silent fury, landing a solid punch that snapped one man's head back. But he was outnumbered. As he struggled to get to his feet, a third man brought the butt of his rifle down hard across Luke's shoulders, driving him to his knees with a cry of pain. Clara screamed. She tried to run to him, to throw herself between him and his attackers, but a pair of strong hands seized her from behind. She was lifted off her feet, her arms pinned to her sides. She kicked and struggled, her cries lost in the din of the brawl. Through a blur of panicked tears, she saw Thorn get to his feet, wipe a smear of blood from his lip, and drive a vicious kick into Luke's ribs. Luke grunted and collapsed onto his side, the breath driven from his lungs. "Get her on a horse!" Thorn bellowed, his voice raw with triumph. Clara was dragged toward a horse, her feet scrabbling for purchase in the mud. She twisted her head, her last sight of him that of his still form lying on the ground, his face pressed into the dirt of the home they had made together. Then she was thrown sideways across a saddle, and the world became a sickening, lurching blur of sky and earth as they rode away, leaving him behind. That night, Luke rode into Cottonwood Crossing. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. His back was a landscape of deep, purple bruises, and his ribs ached with every breath. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold, hard rage that had settled in his heart. The town was quiet, its windows glowing with a false warmth. To him, every shadow held a threat, every closed door a judgment. The jailhouse was a small, squat building made of stone, with a single lamp burning in the sheriff's office. Luke swung down from his horse and strode inside without knocking. Sheriff Brody was sitting behind his desk, a bottle of whiskey and a glass at his elbow. He looked up, and the color drained from his face when he saw Luke standing there, bruised and mud-stained, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Where is she?" Luke demanded, his voice low and raspy. "Now, Luke, calm down," the sheriff began, trying to inject a note of authority into his voice. "She is locked up, safe and sound. She will see the circuit judge in the morning. She is innocent, and you know it. Thorn paid that man to lie. You are a party to it." Brody slammed his hand on the desk. "I am the law here, and I am tired of you protecting that woman. She has brought nothing but trouble. Jedediah Thorn is a respected man in this community. I have his word against hers. Now, you get out of my jail before I lock you up beside her." Luke stared at the sheriff, at his weak, whiskey-flushed face, and knew that arguing was useless. Brody had made his choice. He had chosen the powerful over the powerless. Luke turned without another word and walked out, the sheriff's angry shouting following him into the night. He stood outside in the darkness, his mind racing. He could not leave her in that cell. He could not let them send her to prison on a lie. Desperation, cold and sharp, settled over him. He looked up and down the empty street. There was a young deputy, a new man named Miller, making his rounds. Luke had seen him at the ranch, had seen the look of unease on his face during the brawl. He had not been eager for the violence. He was the weak link. Luke waited in the alleyway beside the jailhouse. When Deputy Miller came around the corner, Luke stepped out of the shadows. The young man jumped, his hand flying to the pistol on his hip. "Easy, son," Luke said, his voice calm. "I am not here to cause you trouble." "Mr. Harding," Miller stammered. "You should not be here. The sheriff—" "I know what the sheriff said," Luke interrupted. "I want to ask you something, man to man. You were there today. You saw what happened. You saw Jedediah Thorne's face. Did that look like a man interested in justice, or did it look like a man consumed by spite?" The deputy swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around. "It is not my place to say." "Is it your place to stand by while an innocent woman is railroaded?" Luke pressed, his voice soft but insistent. "I am not asking you to draw your gun. I am not asking you to risk your skin. All I'm asking for is 5 minutes. 5 minutes for you to continue your rounds, to walk to the far end of the street and back. That is all. Give me 5 minutes to right a wrong that you know is a wrong." He looked deep into the young man's eyes, appealing not to the deputy, but to the man. Miller's face was a study in conflict. He was afraid of the sheriff, afraid of Thorne. But Luke could see a flicker of decency there, a conscience that was deeply troubled by the day's events. The deputy stared at Luke for a long, agonizing moment. Then, without a word, he averted his eyes and said, "It is a cold night. I think I will walk down to the livery and back. To keep warm." He turned and walked away, his back ramrod straight, his pace deliberate. It was all Luke needed. He moved to the side of the jailhouse. The cell window was small, barred, but not impossible. He worked quickly, using a length of iron he had pulled from a broken wagon to pry at the soft mortar around the window frame. It was loud, clumsy work, but he had his 5 minutes. The frame finally came loose with a grating screech. "Clara," he whispered into the darkness. A face appeared in the opening. "Luke, you are hurt." "I am all right. We have to go now." He reached in, grabbed her hands, and pulled her through the narrow opening. She was scraped and bruised, but she was free. He boosted her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, his battered body screaming in protest. They rode out of town, not toward the ranch, but east, into the dark, unforgiving wilderness. They fled into the teeth of a coming storm. A cold spring rain began to fall, turning the trail to a slick, treacherous mud. They rode hard, Luke pushing the horse to its limits, the fear of pursuit a spur in his side. Clara clung to him, her face buried in his back, the rain plastering her hair to her skin. The world was a nightmare of darkness, pounding rain, and the terrified, rhythmic breathing of the horse beneath them. They were fugitives now, hunted, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a single, exhausted horse. Hours later, as a watery, gray dawn began to break, Luke finally slowed the horse to a walk. They were deep in the wilderness, miles from any town. He guided the horse down a familiar embankment, through a screen of willows, and into a small clearing. It was the place where they had first met. He slid from the saddle, his body aching, and lifted her down. Her legs gave way, and he held her, supporting her weight. They stood there for a long moment, clinging to each other, the only sound the dripping of the rain from the trees and the gentle murmur of the river beside them. It was over. For now. The dam of Clara's control finally broke. A great shuddering sob escaped her, and she began to weep, her tears mingling with the rain on her face. It was the sound of a heart breaking for the second time, a despair so profound it seemed to have no bottom. "They will never let us be," she wept, her voice muffled against his chest. "They will hunt us. We will never be safe." He held her tighter, stroking her wet hair, letting her cry. He let the storm of her grief wash over them, knowing that it had to be shed. When her sobs finally began to subside into ragged, exhausted breaths, he tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. His face was bruised and streaked with mud, but his eyes were clear and filled with a resolve that was as hard and unyielding as granite. "Then we'll live where they can't find us." His words, spoken by the river of their beginning, became the compass for their new life. Then we'll live where they can't find us. It was a simple vow, but it held the weight of their world. They turned their backs on the flat, open plains that held their sorrows and their enemies, and rode deeper into the hazy, purple mountains that had always been a distant promise on the horizon. For days they traveled, pushing upward into the high country, following game trails and ancient animal paths. Their journey a silent, determined flight from the world of men. They found their sanctuary in a place the mapmakers had forgotten. It was a small, hidden valley, cradled between two great granite shoulders of a mountain, accessible only by a narrow, winding pass that was easily missed. A clear, cold stream, born from the snowmelt far above, tumbled through the valley floor, its water so pure it tasted of stone and sky. The valley was filled with tall pines and aspens, and its floor was a lush meadow, thick with wild grasses and flowers. It was a place of profound, cathedral-like quiet, a world away from the dust and malice of Cottonwood Crossing. Here they could be safe. Here they could begin again. They started with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a single horse, a rifle, an axe, and the unyielding will to survive. Their first shelter was a crude lean-to of pine branches, a temporary shield against the elements. Their days became a testament to the raw, demanding labor of building a life from scratch. Luke, his body healed enough for the work, taught Clara how to fell a tree, how to read its lean and make the precise cuts that would bring it down safely. Together, they stripped the logs of their bark, notched their ends, and, with a system of levers and sheer, agonizing effort, raised the walls of a new cabin, log by heavy log. The work was brutal, relentless. Their hands became calloused and raw, their muscles aching with a permanent, deep-seated weariness. But it was an honest weariness, a clean exhaustion born of creation, not of fear. With every log they set in place, they were not just building a shelter, they were building a fortress for their fragile peace. They built a stone fireplace, hauling the rocks from the stream bed one by one. They chinked the logs with a mixture of mud and moss to seal out the wind. By the time the first snows of the next winter dusted the high peaks, they had a home. It was small and rough, but it was theirs, built with their own 4 hands, a testament to their shared endurance. In this quiet, isolated world, a profound healing began. For Clara, the change was a slow, gentle sunrise after a long and starless night. The constant, grinding fear that had been her companion for so long began to recede, replaced by the simple, grounding rhythms of their new life. She grew strong, not just in body, but in spirit. The haunted, hollowed-out look in her eyes was replaced by a clear, steady gaze. She learned the secrets of the valley, which roots were good to eat, where the wild berries grew thickest, how to read the clouds to predict the weather. The land, which had once been her enemy, was now her provider, her teacher. One afternoon, as she was returning from the stream with 2 heavy buckets of water, she stumbled on an exposed root, sending water sloshing down the front of her deerskin tunic. Luke, who was carving a new handle for his axe, looked up and saw her standing there, dripping and looking utterly chagrined. A slow smile spread across his face. "The stream seems to have a powerful thirst today," he remarked, his voice full of dry humor. And then it happened. A sound he had never heard from her before. It started as a small, surprised giggle, and then blossomed into a full, genuine laugh. It was a clear, beautiful sound, like the tumbling water of the stream itself, a sound of pure, unburdened joy. The sound startled them both into silence. Luke stared at her, his carving forgotten in his hands, his heart filled with an emotion so powerful it was a physical ache. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, as if she could not believe the sound had come from her own throat. Then their eyes met, and they both began to laugh together, a shared, wonderful, healing sound that echoed through their quiet valley. Luke's healing was a quieter, more internal process. The guilt he carried for Eleanor, for the life he felt he had stolen from her, had been a constant, heavy cloak upon his shoulders. But in the simple, honest peace of the valley, in the presence of this resilient woman who had faced her own abyss and climbed out, the weight of that cloak began to lessen. He was not a man who spoke easily of his feelings, but Clara saw the change in him. She saw it in the way the hard lines around his mouth would soften when he watched her tending her small, burgeoning garden. She saw it in the contented sighs that escaped him as they sat by the fire at night. The silence between them no longer a void of shared sorrow, but a comfortable space of shared peace. He was a man who had been defined by what he had lost. Now, he was slowly, cautiously, allowing himself to be defined by what he had found. Their past was not entirely gone. It was a ghost that still walked the edges of their new life. Occasionally, from a high ridge overlooking the plains below, they would see them, a string of riders, tiny figures moving across the vast expanse, a posse or a group of ranchers. At the sight of them, a cold dread would seize them. They would retreat into the cover of the deep forest, their hearts pounding, until the figures disappeared into the distance. It was a stark reminder that the world they had fled was still out there, that their peace was a secret that had to be kept. They were never found, but the threat was a constant, low hum beneath the quiet surface of their days. One spring, nearly 2 years after they had arrived, Clara was exploring a part of the valley they rarely visited, a small, sun-drenched meadow near the source of the stream. There, growing from a fissure in a great, granite boulder, she found a single wild rose. It was a small, tenacious thing, its stem thorny and tough, but its bloom was a burst of perfect, delicate pink against the harsh gray of the stone. She stood before it for a long time, her heart full. It was a symbol of her own life, of beauty and resilience blooming in the most unlikely of places. She did not pick it. She left it there as a small, wild shrine to survival. That night, she told Luke about the rose. He listened, as he always did, with a quiet, focused attention. The next day, he presented her with a gift. It was a small notebook, its cover made of cheap cardboard, its pages filled with blank, ruled lines. It was something he had kept tucked away in the bottom of his saddlebags, a forgotten relic from his old life. "I thought," he said, his voice a little rough, "that you might want to write down your thoughts, so they are not lost." Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she took the small, precious gift. He understood. He saw her not just as a partner in survival, but as a person with a story, with a soul that needed to speak. That evening, by the light of a tallow candle, she sharpened a piece of charcoal and began to write. She wrote about Thomas and Sarah, not with the raw, tearing grief of before, but with a gentle, loving sadness, a desire to preserve their memory. And she began to write their story, hers and Luke's. She wrote of the riverbank, of the cabin, of the flight into the mountains. She wrote, as she scrawled in the front of the book, "So we don't vanish like dust." Months bled into a year, and another. Their life in the hidden valley was hard, but it was good. It was real. Then, one late summer afternoon, their peace was shattered by the strike of a serpent. Luke was clearing rocks from a patch of land they intended to use for a winter wheat crop. He reached down to move a large, flat stone, and the rattlesnake, which had been coiled in the cool darkness beneath it, struck without warning. It bit him on the forearm, its fangs sinking deep. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain and shock. Clara, who was weeding her garden nearby, looked up to see him stumbling back, his face a mask of horror as he stared at the 2 small, bleeding puncture marks on his arm. The snake slithered away into the rocks, its rattle a dry, menacing whisper. Fear, cold and absolute, seized Clara. She ran to him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Already, a dark, ugly swelling was beginning to spread from the wound. Luke, his face pale and beaded with sweat, looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not just pain, but a terrible, final resignation. "Clara," he gasped, his breath coming in short, sharp pants. "There is nothing—" "No," she said, her voice a command. She tore a strip of cloth from her apron and tied it tightly above the wound. She looked at the sky. A great dark bank of thunderclouds was rolling in from the west, the air thick and heavy with an impending storm. The memory of another man, another storm, another futile battle against death rose up, threatening to paralyze her. But she pushed it down with a force of will she did not know she possessed. She had been a victim of winter once. She would not be a victim of summer now. She refused to lose another loved one. "I am going for help," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "There is no one," he argued, his voice growing weaker. "The storm. I will find someone." She helped him back to the cabin, settling him on the bed, his breathing already becoming labored. She grabbed the rifle, saddled their horse with frantic, desperate speed, and without a backward glance, rode out of the valley, straight into the face of the approaching storm. She rode with a singular, terrifying purpose. The storm broke with a clap of thunder that shook the very mountains. Rain fell in a blinding, solid sheet, turning the steep game trails into treacherous, muddy slides. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in brief, ghastly flashes. But Clara did not slow down. She was no longer the broken woman who had wandered barefoot across the plains. She was a woman with something to lose, and that made her fearless. She rode for hours, driven by a love that was more powerful than her fear of the storm, more powerful than her fear of the men who might be hunting her. Late that night, soaked, mud-spattered, and on the verge of collapse, she stumbled into the flickering firelight of a small, isolated camp. It belonged to a man named Dr. Elias Vance, a traveling doctor who served the remote homesteads and mining camps, a man who believed his duty was to the sick, not to the gossip of towns. She poured out her story, her words tumbling over one another in her desperation. He looked at her wild, pleading eyes, saw the truth and the terror there, and without hesitation, he packed his medical bag and followed her back into the storm. They arrived back at the cabin to find Luke delirious, his arm swollen to the shoulder, his skin burning with fever. The doctor worked quickly, his face grim. He lanced the wound, applied a poultice of herbs and clay, and forced a bitter, dark liquid down Luke's throat for the rest of the night. Clara and the doctor kept vigil, bathing Luke's feverish skin and listening to his ragged, shallow breathing. It was a long, desperate battle fought in the flickering lamplight, and Clara could only watch and pray. By dawn, the fever broke, Luke's breathing deepened, and he fell into a natural, healing sleep. The doctor, his face etched with exhaustion, gave a weary nod. "He is a strong man. He will live." He accepted no payment, only a hot meal and a fresh cup of coffee before he continued on his lonely circuit. A brief, compassionate visitor from a world they no longer belonged to. That night, Luke was weak, but his mind was clear. Clara sat by his bed, holding his hand, her body humming with a weariness so profound it was almost peaceful. The storm had passed, and the only sound was the gentle dripping of water from the eaves of the cabin. He turned his head on the pillow to look at her. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "If I die, don't stay by the river waiting. Don't you do it!" Even now, his first thought was for her, that she should not be consumed by grief again, that she should live. A faint, tender smile touched her lips. She squeezed his hand, her touch conveying all the love, all the gratitude, all the fierce joy she felt that he was still with her. "You asked if I was hungry or lonely?" she said, her voice soft and full of a quiet, unshakable peace. "Now I'm neither." Years passed. The world outside changed. The territories became states. The railroads spider-webbed across the plains, and the wildness of the West was slowly, relentlessly tamed. But in a small, hidden valley deep in the mountains, time moved at a different pace. One day, a young traveler, a prospector searching for silver, lost his way and stumbled into the valley. He saw a small, sturdy cabin with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. A woman with silver-streaked hair and a face lined with a life of sun and wind was tending a lush garden filled with vegetables and flowers. She was humming softly to herself, a simple, contented tune. The prospector, wary of strangers, stayed hidden in the trees, but he watched for a time, intrigued by the palpable sense of peace that radiated from the small homestead. He saw the inside of the cabin through the open door. It was neat and simple, and on the wall, he saw two things that stuck in his memory. One was a man's worn, wide-brimmed hat, hanging from a wooden peg. The other was a piece of faded paper, tacked to the wall beside it. The handwriting was faint and feminine. He was too far away to read all the words. But in a moment when the sunlight caught it just right, he could make out the last few and found love instead. He backed away quietly, leaving the inhabitants to their solitude, feeling as though he had trespassed on a sacred place. As he found his way out of the valley, the last thing he heard was the sound of the stream flowing endlessly over its stony bed, a sound that was gentle, constant, and forgiving. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.